On behalf of our listeners and myself, we are greatly honored for the opportunity of having the eminent scientist, Professor Paul Ehrlich, with us. Professor Ehrlich will revisit with us and for us the issue of population bomb. Paul is the Bing Professor of Population Studies and President of the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University. The entomologists among us, and I was trained in master thesis as an entomologist, are really proud. Paul is one of us. He was trained as an entomologist working on one of the most attractive group of organisms, butterflies, but he is also a prominent ecologist and a demographer. He is active in policy research on issues of population and resources. Professor Ehrlich is a fellow of the most important scientific institution in the U.S., American Association of the Advancements of Science, U.S. National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. The World Ecology Medal from the International Center for Tropical Ecology is one of a long list of impressive awards that Professor Ehrlich has won over the years. He was also awarded the Environmental Prize by the United Nations Environmental Program, the Eminent Ecologist Award by the Ecological Society of America, and the Blue Planet Prize of the Asahi Glass Foundation in Japan. Professor Ehrlich is known worldwide for his scientific bestseller, The Population Bomb, that was published in '68. Although Annie, his wife, co-authored the book, we understand that the publisher insisted that there will be a single author. At least here we should recognize her contribution to this issue. The book raised concern regarding humanity's future in light of the prediction of the consequences of overpopulation. The book's first prediction were that unavoidable famine, which hundreds of millions of people will die, and a substantial increase in the world death rate. When the fearful predictions did not fully materialize, the book received much criticism. One way or the other, it raised the awareness worldwide of the issue of population growth. In 2009, Professor Paul Ehrlich and his wife were quoted saying perhaps the most serious flaw in the bomb was that it was much too optimistic about the future, attributing its failed predictions to some change in humanity's behavior. It alerted people to the importance of environmental issues and brought human numbers into the debate on the human future. Today, as humanity crossed the line of 7 billion inhabitants and is still increasing, it is urgent more than ever to renew the discussion with a fresh outlook. Professor Ehrlich will revisit with us the issue of population bomb. Professor Ehrlich, please.
Everybody here all right back there? Okay? Sounds okay. Oh, yeah. What happened to the bottle of gin? We're going to, okay. After dinner. Okay, that's fine. After the talk. I'm sound asleep, but I've got eyeballs planted on my eyelids, so I look like I'm awake. So if I blink, it'll make you sick, but don't worry about it. First of all, I just thinking of the drive I had over here and the prospect of having 20 million Israelis. It's an interesting prospect. The basic scientific answer is don't hold your breath. What I'm going to talk about now for the next 3 hours, I'm going to set the bezel on my watch so I don't go over the time limit that's been imposed on me, is a security issue. It came to mind because, of course, while I was in Bathsheba, Hamas tried to get rid of me but failed. The IDF intercepted the missiles. But I think one of the sad things around the world, and of course Israel is no exception to this, is that people don't understand that there are much more serious security problems than the ones that have to do with who you're fighting next door and so on. And that those security problems, just like the debt problems, the other ones, are really trivial compared to the things we're facing. We just had, you may have heard, an election in the United States. where no single important issue was discussed. None. But almost all the emphasis and almost all the emphasis after the election was on what to do about the debt. Nobody mentioned that, for example, if there's massive debt, that means somewhere there's massive credit. And that, in fact, the whole debt problem can be solved with pencil and paper or pen and paper by negotiating with people. You would have some unhappiness, no question. There'd be redistribution of income and so on and so forth. But there's nothing intrinsically unsolvable about the debt crisis. On the other hand, you can't go to nature and say, look, we're going to blow through 2 degrees Celsius. There's no question about it. We're just the way we're behaving. And so we'd like to negotiate with you for 4 degrees to still be able to raise our crops, get our water, and so on and so forth. So we have a situation there, as here, where your politicians, most of your politicians, are utterly ignorant of how the world works, utterly ignorant of the threats that are facing civilization, utterly ignorant of the debate that's going on in the scientific community now, not about whether population is important. The scientific community has spoken out on this repeatedly, in quantity, totally reviewed. There's no argument among scientists about whether population is an important issue. It still is, however, an important thing that is being ignored by all of our politicians. Let me run over, I know this is a self-selected audience, so I'm going to run over some problem of overconsumption among the rich and so on that are now facing us. The list is moderately long. At the top of it, because of being, and I'm going to say something about each one, and I'm going to say things that I hope you don't already know or that are not covered well in your media. At the top of the list, you got to put climate disruption, not because it's necessarily the worst problem that's driven by population growth and overconsumption among the rich and by population size, but because it's the only one that most people, at least in the United States, recognize as a serious environmental problem. In Australia in the field at the time of Sandy, I was glad to be there, not with my daughter in Washington, D.C., when she escaped any serious damage. But one of the things there are several things about climate disruption that are not covered very much in the literature and not at all in the mainstream media. People are now very much worried about sea level rise. In a sense, they ought to be. That's the one sure thing you know is going to happen if the planet warms. Because, of course, even if there wasn't any ice on land to melt, when you warm water, it expands. Guess what? You warm the oceans, they crawl up the shores. But it's actually a relatively minor problem compared to the other things connected with climate disruption. It's minor because it probably, first of all, unless we're very unlucky with the East Antarctic ice sheet and so on, you'll be able to walk away from the sea level rise. If you're having dinner at Manta Ray, you can get up from your table and leave and probably not drown with sea level rise. It's likely to seriously affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Places like Bangladesh, where, for example, most of their agricultural land will soon be underwater, and so on. But that's nothing compared to the roughly millennium or more of changes in precipitation patterns that are already entrained by the amount of greenhouse gases we've injected into the atmosphere. Our country, more so than yours, more so than China, has been totally ignoring the problem, not just of having to revise your entire energy handling infrastructure over the next decade or so, but also the need to entirely reorganize and refurbish the infrastructure of handling water. In fact, in the United States, most of our water handling infrastructure is deteriorating when it needs to be rebuilt and rebuilt for flexibility, because it's not going to be a rebuilding of the cards. This year we have really good agricultural conditions in Area A, but it's going to be switched and then it's going to be in Area B, and we'll have to work to be able to grow our crops there. It's going to be A to B to C to D to E to F. And there are other things besides climate that affect crops, like where the soils are, what the soils are like, and so on. So the prospect is that simply damaging agriculture is likely to threaten the lives of billions of people, not hundreds of millions. If you read the literature on this, you're often exposed now to the story that one of the big issue is how the hell can we possibly feed 9.5 billion people by 2050, particularly feeding them the diets they want, because there's this huge push among the rich country that's developing within India, say, and the rich country that's developing within China, to switch to a meat diet, which of course requires much more farm productivity and so on if you're going to supply it. But I was just at a meeting actually in Stockholm with ecologists and economists, and the answer is we're not. There's just no way we're going to be able to feed 9.5 billion people. In fact, the yield gap that everybody talks about closing, the yield gap is simply the gap between how much corn we can grow in Iowa versus how much corn can be grown in southern Mexico, say. Their yield is lower than it is in Iowa. The assumption is that if we work really hard at it, we'll be able to increase the yields in places where they're relatively low to increase the food supply. It's not a dumb idea, but it ignores two things. One, we've been struggling to do that for a long time, and we're hitting ceilings in rice and in wheat and so on that make it look like it's going to be very difficult to increase there. But of course, the yield gap is more likely to be closed by a decline in the amount that in the yields in places like Iowa. And the reason is that the crops that we grow were adapted genetically over a long period to an unusually constant climate. In other words, humanity developed agriculture and developed this huge successful enterprise in a time of unusual climate stability. You screw around with the climate, it's more likely that the yields are going to drop than they're going to go up. And in fact, there's already signs, David Lobel and his colleagues at Stanford have shown that already places where the yields were starting to increase because of the heating, that is slowing down. So one of the big problems, I said one maybe take-home message is that the climate problem is much more serious in terms of changing precipitation patterns, and I won't get into things like the melting of the Himalayan water tower and so on. Much more likely to be dramatic there than simply from sea level rise, although sea level rise is a long way from trivial. You might want to use, as was demonstrated by Sandy, relatively small amounts of sea level rise can have very catastrophic results because, among other things, it increases the run-in of storm surges, which also can salinate fields, can salinate coastal aquifers, and of course can drown people. So we've already had on the east coast of the United States since 1900 about a 1-foot rise in sea level, and that's already was largely responsible for much of the damage from the Sandy incident. So one of the big problems is climate disruption. Another big problem that a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues think is probably more significant than the climate disruption is the toxification of the entire planet. We now have toxic chemicals distributed from pole to pole, and the recent work that's been just in the last few years has dramatically shown that the basic conclusion of the toxicologists have been working with for the last 100 years is wrong. And that is, you probably all learned it in high school, that the dose makes the poison. The story usually is, did you know that common table salt is a poison? If you eat a pound of common table salt, you'll die. It's the idea that dose makes the poison. You eat enough of it, you die. It turns out that there are an awful lot of the chemicals that we're making now and distributing are exactly the opposite. They have nonlinear dose-response curves. That is, they're much more dangerous in tiny quantities than in big quantities. And this is all kinds of weird symptoms are showing up both in animals and people related to, as far as scientists can tell, to the fact that if your blood is sent to a laboratory and carefully analyzed, it comes back looking like the shelf list in an organic chemistry lab. You have all of these compounds in your body. We don't know what they do to human beings singly in many cases, most cases. We know nothing about their effects on ecosystems, and we haven't even looked at the synergisms. If you have 100,000 toxic compounds out there, we know that a lot of them will have synergistic effects. That is, the effect of having some of A might be to give you a 10% chance of dying. Some of B will give you maybe a 10% chance of dying. A plus B gives you a 50% chance of dying. And one of the issues is, what if we find out that suddenly all people are getting, almost all people, are getting pancreatic cancer by the time they're 4? A lot of these things operate much more powerfully on young people, particularly on fetuses and infants. What do we do then? In climate, we have a set of nutcase solutions in case it gets away from us. They're deeply crazy, but we have them. Have the battleship Missouri, fire its 16-inch guns every 5 minutes for the next 250,000 years, putting crap in the atmosphere to shade out the planet, or building a sunscreen somewhere between us and the sun to reduce the solar radiation. These all ignore the fact, of course, that if you keep putting the CO2 into the atmosphere, you're turning the oceans into Coca-Cola. And so you're giving up fish to start out with. Coral reefs are already on their way out, and so on. But for the toxics problem, we don't have any nutcase solution. We don't. These things are very difficult. If you identify it, what do you do? Get your graduate students out there with hand lenses and forceps to pull the chemicals out of the global environment. So if that happens, we're in really deep trouble. There's a lot of, one of the things may solve the population problem is there are stories and there are data about human sperm counts and motility dropping globally. There's a lot of controversy about whether it's right or wrong, but it's the kind of thing that makes people nervous. It would, of course, we could end the population explosion entirely. It takes me back to the good old days. You're all too young to remember the women's movement, but one of my favorite lines from it is, "A woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle." And so we could get there already. What are some of the other problems? Well, land degradation is tied very much into climate change. It's where I was, one of the reasons I went to the conference that Alan Paul hooked me into down south on the missile range. That was on land degradation, desertification and land degradation. It's the element we know least about. For instance, the data on erosion are terrible. We know we have to stop plowing, but we don't know how soon. We don't know how serious that is. We know that we're running out of groundwater. It's being overpumped in many places, but we know where the rates are too high, but we don't know how much is actually left. We do know that if you do a lot of, the worst form of land degradation, of course, is building cities on the land or paving it over. And when you pave it over, what most people don't recognize is you often, for instance, Long Island has sandy soils. It's now getting more and more paved. Long Island is part of New York, basically, and that stops the infiltration of the water into the aquifers. Not just of land degradation, but of course of removing one of our most valuable resources, and that is our underground water. So that's a big problem. The loss of biodiversity. We are now at the edge of the greatest extinction since the one at the KT boundary when the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. People say, well, what the hell? Dinosaurs disappeared. Here we are. We're happy. We're healthy. We're wise, and so on. But of course, 65 million years ago, we weren't trying to run a complex industrial society with 7+ billion people. It's the other parts of the systems that run our lives. In other words, we can't do. For instance, get rid of biodiversity, get rid of natural predators, can't grow crops anymore because if you keep trying to kill them with pesticides, what you do is develop resistant pests. You then use more pesticides. At some point, the pests will get more resistant than you will and be killing off people. Pollination is already now much in the news in the United States. Failure of pollination services. The other organisms of the planet are critical to us, and we're wiping them out. And many people consider that the most serious of all, because the climate could restabilize in a few thousand years. Biodiversity, if we wipe out most of it, will take millions of years to restore the kind of level we have. And you can go on with other charming things. There's a new book by Michael Clare called The Race for What's Left, about the resource situation. If you know the literature on collapse, and by the way, the big debate in the scientific community is, can we avoid a collapse? One of the signs that Joe Taylor put in his classic book, technical book on collapses of civilizations, was that a clear sign is when you get diminishing returns to complexity. And that's exactly what we're getting. What do you mean by that? I'll just give you a simple example. First oil well in North America went down 69.5 feet from the surface of Pennsylvania and hit oil. The Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf, that wonderful public relations operation by BP, started a mile under the sea and went down 2 more miles to hit oil. That's diminishing returns to
one of the things that's never mentioned in the media, if they get so far as even mentioning the population problem, rarely discussed even technically, although it's in the literature thoroughly for a long time, is the nonlinearity in the population problem itself. Human beings are smart. We didn't start farming the marginal land and now are working our way to the river valleys to grow and now start growing our crops on rich soils. In fact, we started in the river valleys. It's where we grew our crops. Then we built our cities on the river valleys. If you've been in Manila or Delhi, you've seen them expanding over the very best land. And so what that means basically is that every person you add of this next 2.5 billion is going to do infinitely more damage than people in the last 2.5 billion, because you're going to have to feed them on land that's more marginal. You're going to have to use more energy to generate more fertilizer and more problems there. The water you get for them is going to have to be transported further, purified more, all uses energy, all wrecks the environment, and it's just going to continue in that direction, but you never hear it mentioned. So that the disaster that will be created if we try and add 2.5 billion people to the global environment, or even another million people to Israel, it's going to be just disastrous, and we're already seeing the edges of that disaster. So the nonlinearities are really important. Oil, by the way, we're now, a lot of the conversation during our election was how the U.S. was going to become the oil supplier to the world. That's like if you had a hungry world, we would become the cyanide supplier to it. Because what's crystal clear to every scientist is that we've got to stop using fossil fuels. We've got to start by getting rid of the coal, then the oil, and then the gas. We can't do it all instantly because we're incredibly hooked on fossil fuels. And to show how all these things relate together, interesting, it would be an experiment you could try here at Tel Aviv University. I know what would happen if we tried it at Stanford. Stop 100 faculty members and ask them where their food comes from. What's the answer you're going to get from 98 of them? The supermarket, that's right. Nowhere in our educational systems, in your country or mine, is everybody brought into the facts of humanity's most important enterprise, that is getting food, and it's also of the humanity's biggest industry. But how many people know that there's a huge fossil fuel subsidy in agriculture, so that it's one of the major consumers of fossil fuels, that some people estimate as much as 35% of the greenhouse gases are put into the atmosphere from agriculture. And of course, agriculture is what's wrecked most by climate disruption, that agriculture is the biggest destroyer of biodiversity, that if you didn't have a transport system, it wasn't integral into the system, that for instance in the United States, if you didn't have a transport system, everybody would quickly starve. And that's possible, for instance, if there is a solar storm that simply ruins all the transformers in North America. It's something that's happened about every 125 years, and we haven't had it once since we've had the current electrical grid. If you had that, virtually everybody starved to death. San Francisco area, we probably have 3 days supply of food. If you don't have transformers and electricity, you can't pump fuel, you can't run trucks, you can't run trains, and the distribution system is absolutely central to the agricultural enterprise. All these things ought to be second nature to kids by the time they're in the 5th or 6th grade. And we don't teach it at all, and most of our college faculties don't even know it, and yet it's the single most important thing we do. All these things are tied together. It's not a list, it's a complex. Add in the fact that the more people there are, well known in the scientific literature, the greater the chances are of huge epidemics. All of our infectious diseases transferred to us from other animals. They weren't a problem for hunter-gatherers. You had to have certain size population before the disease could even stick in the human population. The easier, the more people you have, and particularly the more people who are immune compromised, that is not decent diets. And we were very much criticized for saying in the population bomb, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. And everybody says, how could you possibly say that? Well, that was 44 years ago. There are roughly 1 billion people hungry, and probably 2 billion more that are inadequately nourished out of the 7 billion we have. And of course, they're targets. They're very easy to infest. In fact, And so the chances of transfers, as you get larger populations pushed into closer contact with the animal reservoirs of disease, the chances of transfer become higher. And then, of course, with our wonderful transit systems, the chance of it spreading through the whole human population is greatly enhanced. And people who know this stuff well are very scared of things like the Chinese agricultural system, where you mix ponding of ducks and pigs and rice culture all together. It's just a sort of a laboratory designed to produce more lethal flus and so on. Yet again, in the U.S., we're not really prepared, and I think they're probably not here for really big epidemics. There are not enough hospital beds. There are not enough vaccines or vaccine production facilities there. There's not any real monitoring. And when I was a kid, long time ago, when I got scarlet fever, a sign went up on the door and said, you can't enter here. There was, I'm having a senior moment, and I can't remember what's the term for quarantine. Yeah, there were standards for quarantine. We don't have any standards for quarantine anymore, even though our transport is much higher. And finally, or not really finally, if you read Mike Clare's book or any of his other books on resource wars, the odds of resource wars are going up continually. The classic one, of course, is the '67 water war right here. And when I talk to earth scientists, I'm usually said to be too optimistic. If I really understood the water situation, I'd understand how bad things are. And of course, right here, you're living both in an area where the climate models indicate there's going to be less water, more extremes, but you also have in Israel a huge talent for how to handle water and how to deal with it. You do better than most countries. The Chinese try too. The Americans don't pay any attention to this, but at least there's a place where Israel could really become a world leader and push out and get, for instance, indicate how you could solve problems with neighbors getting onto the really serious problems, because slinging missiles around and so on and going and punishing them with tanks and so on is one thing. When you don't have any water, it's going to get really grim unless you have already made good arrangements for it. You share water resources with your neighbors, and one of the things that Israel has tried to do, but ought to try to do harder, is to get together and say, look, all this other crap is really minor. If we don't solve our water problems, if we don't solve our population problems, forget it. That's where our real security lies. You can't be secure in an arid area if you don't have water. So I've painted a picture that's not entirely charming. I could go on and discuss what will happen if we have a resource war that turns nuclear, where I think the biggest odds there are not probably a mistake by the Russians and Americans, who stupidly point nuclear weapons at each other all the time for reasons that are obscure, I think, even to our military. There's a great danger, of course, of the U.S. and China are preparing to fight over the fossil fuels that are left in Central Asia. I'm a member of the largest empire that's ever walked the face of the earth. It's not the same kind of empire as the British have, but of course, maybe you don't know, but we have a CENTCOM, which is our military establishment to control Central Asia. We have an AFRICOM, our military establishment designed to control the oil. It's all designed to control oil resources. 40% of our military budget, the biggest in the world, is designed solely to make sure we control oil, which, as I said before, is equivalent to having 40% of our military budget to control the cyanide supplies we want to keep bringing in to eat. Absolute, total insanity. Just think about, look at our behavior. I'm not proud of American behavior. Just think if you were a Pakistani and there was always overhead an American drone that could blow you up at any moment and blew up the odd wedding party and so on, and apologize. What would you feel like? In other words, our behavior is execrable in this area, and most of my colleagues, I think all of my colleagues, agree with that, but you can't get anything done because, among other things, the oil companies want to get in there and make money, and they don't care about the future. So I painted a picture, not entirely charming, but let's talk about what might be done about this. What might a group like this do? I'm just curious, how many of you are connected in any way with Tel Aviv University? Fair number of you. Well, the first thing we could do is work at Stanford, which we're doing, and at Tel Aviv, to try and make universities relevant to the world again. It's interesting that nowhere in the world, as far as I know, are universities leading the way in dealing with these problems. We've formed an organization at Stanford, which is a global organization now called the Millennium Alliance of Humanity and the Biosphere, which is aimed at trying to get all academics together in different disciplines to try and deal with these problems. All universities that I know about, certainly in the U.S., have a formal structure that was actually put together by an old friend of mine. I'm glad to talk to a young audience. It's a guy named Aristotle, and he's the one who developed the disciplines that we still have. They were formalized really recently in about 1680 by the Royal Society. Can you think of a single serious human problem that could be solved within one department at your university? They don't exist. We have the Division of the Social Sciences is long noted as a disgrace. The Gulbenkian report said it something like 30 years ago. What excuse is there for having a psychology department, an economics department, a social science department, a political science department, on and on and on, when you couldn't be a human behavioral scientist without knowing a fair amount about all of the things that are covered or overlapped in those areas. So we're trying with some success to recruit the social scientists, the people in the humanities, the people in the arts into a general battle to get things changed and to try and use the academic world to push to get a movement bottom up so that our politicians can have presidential elections without discussing any important issues. You say, what can a person possibly do from the humanities to help with this problem? Well, one of the things that we have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt over the last decade or so is that telling people the scientific facts does not change their behavior. You can see this in the area of climate, where we've had, almost 25 international meetings that have accomplished absolutely nothing. 70% of people in the United States don't believe human beings are involved in changing the climate, or statistics like that everywhere. It's crystal clear that we don't know how to package the message, and we don't know how to get it to people. We need the help of people who can package messages. My favorite story of this isn't from recent history. It comes from, some of you may have remembered that around 1860 to 65, there was a little conflagration in our country called the Civil War. One of the first modern wars, maybe the first modern war, truly an incredibly nasty event with lots of terrorism. U.S. terrorism is an old U.S. habit. We have used terrorism as a policy instrument for actually several hundred years already. When it was in the middle of the war, President Lincoln was introduced to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she is the author of a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. How many of you ever heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin? It's a book about the horrors of slavery. And when Lincoln met her, he said, you're the little lady who started this big war. And in fact, there was a lot of truth in that. Her message really got through. If you think about what art can do for the environment, think of your own reaction the first time you saw that beautiful photograph of Earth from outer space. There's huge contributions that can be made, and some of them are actually done systematically by social scientists as science. The story I tell everybody about this is a colleague of mine named Bob Cialdini, who's at the University of Arizona. He did a really simple experiment. He conned a hotel into giving him permission. And does everybody know Cialdini's? Probably not. Some of you don't know it anyway. And he went into the hotel rooms, and the first thing he did, I'm faking the thing, but you'll get the basic idea, was take off half the towel racks, the little sign that said, reuse your towel, save the environment. And then he checked and saw what happened in those rooms. And it didn't make any difference. They reuse them at the same level, whether the sign was there or not. So then he did a second experiment. He put a sign in, save the environment one, no sign, and a third one which said, a third type in a third of the rooms, which said, reuse your towels, save the environment. Most people who come to this hotel reuse their towels. And all of a sudden it went up to about 20% better in the ones with that sign. Then he did the same experiment again, except the third one said, reuse your towels, save the environment. Most people who stay in room 323, that's your room, reuse their towels. And it went up to 80%. So then he said, okay, let's try this in a different way. He went to houses that had smart meters. And in the and when they sent their bills, the bill said, if you watch your smart meter, you can save energy and save the environment. And the houses that had that used exactly the same amount of energy as the houses that had no message. Then he goes in and he sends to some of the houses one that says, most people in this city watch their, first thing he says was watch the meter and you can save money by saving energy and the environment. And that didn't make any difference. But when he said, most people in this city watch the meter and save the environment, it went up, to maybe something like 20%. When he said most people on this block do it, it went up to about 80%. Well, you can see right there is lessons that, for instance, if you were organizing, there's a wonderful green movement here, which we don't have in the United States. And I was talking to some of the people in the green movement and said, maybe you can find ways, to use that kind of technique to get more traction with your message. So the basic point of that part of my talk is that we can learn things from the social scientists. Why aren't we learning more? Well, most scientists were not trained to take any social science. For instance, how many scientists that you know? So I've never had a course in social psychology, but I know social psychologists. For instance, one who was advising President Obama and could have, if he listened, could have destroyed Romney in a couple of debates. These people know a lot, but we don't pay much attention to them, and they don't have a clue as to how serious the world problem is. So they want to continue, say, working on how you house poor people decently, which is a very important thing from my point of view. But if we let the population keep growing, it's not going to make any difference. We're going to be fighting over food, not over who's housed where and what. So our priorities are just like, again, Obama, I thought, made a terrible mistake. Some of you may not know our system. We have a really terrible public health system. And Obama decided to take that on. It is something that should have been taken on. But it required, as we knew it would, a huge amount of political capital. I think he'd have been much better taking on climate change at the same level, because if you think about it, the health consequences of the climate changing are incredibly larger than the health consequences of the insurance companies stealing from you. So people don't think about these things, and that's why we're trying by the way, the MOB is the Millennium Alliance for Humanity, and the Biosphere is mahb.stanford.edu. It costs nothing to join up and put your ideas in. It's basically a bottom-up movement, mahb.stanford.edu. So we have gigantic problems, problems that I just went through, but we also have, as you can see, huge problems of governance. And there you may be luckier than we are in the United States, because our system is really broken. And it's broken in ways that are crystal clear to everybody. You just think about it. In a world situation today, to be able to have a government where the chief operating officer is from an entirely different perspective than the legislature, or most of the legislature, you can see that it leads to absolute roadblocks. People have realized this for a long time. I was involved in the 1970s at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in a program to look at the U.S. Constitution and see what could be done to make it a more effective instrument for the world we thought was coming in this century, and to solve that kind of problem. And shortly after I joined it, they quit. Obviously because I joined it. But no, in our system, in order to get a new constitution, you would have to, you can amend it, but in order to change the whole damn thing in various ways, you have to have a constitutional convention. And they knew what would happen if you had a constitutional convention in the United States. It wouldn't turn out to be over what's the best form of government, of governance. Should we have term limits, no term limits? Should we set up a system? For instance, I think we could have moved towards a British parliamentary system. One that included a monarchy. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an idiot and a dangerous one, but he would have made a marvelous king. Stand up there, look straight, smile, tell funny stories, be senile. It would have been terrific. So all kinds of changes we could have had, but what we would have had is battles over abortion, gay rights, gun control, all the hot-button issues which are absolutely trivial on the scale of what we're talking about. And so they just decided not to do it. And we're suffering with it right now, once again. And so what can I tell you? Well, I'd like to end up by telling you something cheery. This paper I have being reviewed now by the Royal Society is on what are the chances of avoiding a collapse. We have big arguments about this. My Bayesian prior is about 10%, but I think it's really worthwhile to work to make it 11%. Jim Brown, who's the best biogeographer in the world, says I'm crazy, it's only 1%, but he thinks it's worth working to make it 1.1%. That's the level of depression among my colleagues. But one of the things we do know is that human societies can change in complex ways and extremely rapidly when we don't understand what the hell's really going on. The best example I know from recent years is the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which none of my politically sophisticated friends, which included senators and so on, nobody expected it. It happened. And it happened very, very rapidly. By the way, if you're interested in that history, there's a new book out called The Year That Changed the World, I think it is anyway, which really shows how complex it was. It was a mix of things in different countries that had built up, some small groups working in some of those countries, and some outstanding people, with Gorbachev really at the top, who managed to do things, and it all came together in a very sudden, as most of you will remember, change. So there's no reason why we can't get the same kind of change, not just in how we treat the environment, but also in the same sense in how we treat each other. In other words, we could, for instance, see an incredible thing in Israel where the Israelis would begin treating their Arab citizens so well instead of so badly that when an Arab nation says something bad about Israel, a million Israelis would get up and say, we're Arabs, we're in Israel, we think it's a great place, stop this nonsense. That could be done basically overnight if people wanted to do it. So when the time is right, human societies can change very, very rapidly. And the job for people like us, I think, is to do everything we can to ripen the time. Thank you very much.